Hello, everyone. I have today chapter 22 of Book 2 of the Royal Rangers series, The Red Fox Clan. Let's go ahead and get into it. Maddie rode out early the next morning on Sundancer, heading for Warwick's farm. Mindful of Cassandra's instruction not to disappear, she had checked with her mother and ascertained that her Scandian guests wouldn't be arriving before midday. "But that means you have to be back here by 11:30, her mother warned her. "I want to ride down the dock to welcome them." Maddie promised that she would be back well before that time and went to saddle her horse. She rode through the portcullis and across the drawbridge, nodding a friendly greeting to the sentries there, who came to attention to salute her. Once she was in the parkland, she set Sundancer to a gentle canter, enjoying the wind in her hair as the Eridan loped across the neatly tailored grass, his hoofbeats sounding a dull tattoo on the soft ground. When she entered the forest, she had to slow down to a trot. The trees grew too close together here to permit any higher speed, unless in the case of a dire emergency. She whistled as she rode, and Sundancer, sensing her cheerful mood, tossed his head and shook his mane at her. She leaned forward and patted his neck. He was a good horse, but her mood was caused by the fact that she would be seeing Bumper. She hadn't visited the farm in several days, and she was missing her shaggy little companion. "If it weren't for him, you'd be my favorite horse," she said, and Sundancer tossed his head once more at the sound of her voice. Unlike Bumper, however, he didn't reply. Warwick was working in the barn when she rode into the farmyard. He had the big doors open to admit light and was repairing the leather traces on a plow. He strolled out to meet her as she dismounted and then tethered Sundancer to the post by the farmhouse door. "Morning, Maddie," he said cheerfully. "Come to see Bumper, have you?" "That's right, Warwick. And you, of course," she added with a grin, which he matched. She had her ranger cloak rolled up and tied behind her saddle. She took it down now, shook it out, and swung it around her shoulders. The simple act of wearing it made her feel more positive, more confident. The cloak was a symbol of who she was and what she did. "Thought I'd scout around the area," she said. "Has anything been going on?" Warwick screwed up his face thoughtfully before answering. "Not sure," he said. "Barnaby Codling at Codling Farm says he thought there'd been people up at the Abbey again the other night. But Barnaby's inclined to imagine things. Once he hears there's been activity there, he's bound to think he's seen it. Likes a bit of drama, does Barnaby." "Maybe I should take a look," Maddie said. She had loosened the girth straps on Sundancer's saddle and was heading for the barn to saddle Bumper. "Can you feed and water Sundancer for me?" she asked. Warwick nodded. "Be pleased to," he said. He had set down his tools and moved to where the Eridan was standing patiently. He rubbed the velvet nose. Sundancer snuffled and nuzzled his jacket, searching for the apple that was always there for a hungry horse. Warwick chuckled and fed it to him. In the barn, Bumper nickered a welcome to Maddie, his ears pricked and his eyes alert as he put his head over the half door to his stall. She fetched his saddle and bridle from their pegs and lifted the saddle up over his back. "Where have you been?" he demanded. He became quite touchy if Maddie left him to his own devices for too long. She patted his neck, then swung up into the saddle. "I've been busy," she said softly. "I'll tell you about it when we're out of here." "Well, that's all very well, but I've been worried about you. Never know what might happen to you if I'm not around." "Sundancer would look after me," she said, and Bumper snorted loudly, rattling his mane at her. Sundancer? That overbred excuse for a horse? What could he do if you got into trouble? "Sundancer has excellent bloodlines," she told him. But he was unimpressed. All thoroughbreds tend to be hysterical and far too excitable for their own good, or for yours. Ranger horses, of course, were bred from many different bloodlines. The core horse breeders selected horses for their differing qualities, some for speed, some for stamina, some for intelligence, and bred the best of these qualities into the shaggy little horses they provided to the core. As a result, horses like Bumper, who was nothing if not outspoken, tended to be somewhat snobbish about the merits, or otherwise, of thoroughbreds. Maddie sighed. No wonder some people call horses nags. Bumper jerked his head up and lapsed into silence. She smiled to herself. She'd finally got the best of him in a verbal duel, she thought. And she'd been saving that quip for some time now, looking for a chance to use it. "Talking to someone?" Warwick asked as they emerged into the sunlight. She shook her head. "Just myself. Bad habit I've gotten into." Warwick nodded understandingly. "First sign of madness," he said cheerfully. He had a shrewd idea that rangers talked to their horses. He'd heard Gillen do it several times, but it would never do to let on that he knew, of course. "I'll take a look around up at the Abbey," she said. He waved a cheerful farewell to her as she urged Bumper into a trot and headed out of the farmyard into the surrounding forest. They were halfway to the Abbey before Bumper relented and spoke to her again. He was a garrulous little horse, and he couldn't stand to be silent for too long, even if he was pretending to be offended. "What do you expect to find up here?" he asked, as they negotiated the steep track that led to the Abbey. "Probably nothing," she admitted. Warwick didn't place too much faith in the reports that there'd been people up here. The ground around the Abbey, a 2-story stone building with a bell tower at one end, had been cleared of trees, leaving an open space roughly 50 by 30 meters. The wind was stronger up here on the hilltop, and the treetops bent and waved in the breeze. There were several pines among them, and the wind created that strange surf-like sound that pines make as the wind passes through their branches. She twitched the reins lightly, and Bumper came to a stop. She surveyed the area. It seemed unchanged since the last time she had been here. "No sign of anything," she said. The ground was hard and rocky, and she knew it had rained the previous night. That, and the constant wind, would remove any faint trace of tracks that might have been there. Any sign of activity would likely be inside the building. She swung down from the saddle, grunting slightly at the ever-present twinge in her hip as her feet touched the ground and took her weight. "Stay here," she told the horse. He pricked his ears, but said nothing. Even though she didn't expect trouble, she had been trained to be always ready for it. She took her bow from the leather bow case fastened behind Bumper's saddle, unclipped her quiver from the saddle bow, and clipped it onto her belt. The bow and quiver stayed out at the farm with Bumper. A relatively powerful recurve bow and a quiver full of arrows fitted with warheads might create unwanted curiosity around Castle Araluen. She knocked an arrow to the string and advanced toward the Abbey. The double doors were closed, although the left-hand one showed a gap of several centimeters between it and its neighbor. She tried to remember if it had been unlocked on her previous visit, but couldn't. "Some ranger you are," she muttered to herself. It was her constant expression of self-criticism. She stretched her left leg out, placed her foot against the slightly opened door, and shoved hard. There was a loud creak from the rusty hinges as the door swung farther open. The stiffness of the rust in the hinges stopped it before it slammed it back against the doorframe, but it left an opening big enough for her to pass through. She waited, listening for any sound of movement inside. Her heart rate was up, and her breathing came a little faster. To enter the Abbey, she'd have to expose herself in the doorway, silhouetted by the outside light. She'd be a perfect target for anyone inside, if there were anyone inside. Moving quickly and silently, she slipped through the opening, stepping immediately to her right to clear the doorway, filling the opening for only a second or two before she slipped into the concealing shadows inside the old building. Nothing moved, except for a few dry leaves that stirred in the open doorway, swirling around as the wind blew in. Gradually, her eyes became accustomed to the dimness, and she searched the interior, ready for any sign of danger, but there was nothing. The Abbey was a large single room with a small choir gallery against the rear wall. The bell tower rose above this gallery. A rickety old wooden ladder provided access to the gallery, which stood 3 meters above the floor of the main room. The high arched ceiling provided the extra height required to accommodate it. There was a window set in each of the walls beside it. The door was set midway along one of the long side walls, so she could see both the gallery and the altar and the pulpit. Several rows of pews were still standing in the church, but at least half of them had been taken by local inhabitants over the years. They were made of good quality timber, and there was no sense leaving it here to rot. She guessed that if she inspected the farmhouses in the area, she'd find where the old pews had been converted to household furniture, settles, chairs, bedsteads, and the like. The door creaked softly as a stronger than usual gust of wind moved it a few more inches on its stiff hinges. She realized she'd been holding her breath, and let it out now in a long sigh. She lowered the bow and released the tension she'd been holding on the string. Then she saw the fox face. At first sight, it appeared to be nothing more than random scratch marks in the hard-packed earth floor. But then she realized that the marks formed a definite shape. It was upside down from her viewpoint, but as she moved closer, she made it out for what it was, a rough outline of a fox's mask. It was on the floor between 2 of the surviving pews. She guessed that it must have been scratched onto the hard earth with the point of a stick or a metal spike of some sort. Possibly, the artist had been sitting on the pew, idly passing the time, amusing himself while he waited for the meeting, if that was what had transpired here, to begin. One thing was sure, it hadn't been here on her previous visit. So, she said thoughtfully, it looks as if something has been going on here after all. She searched the rest of the floor and found no further sign of activity. But a fox's face scratched into the earth was a good indication of who had been here. It was too big a coincidence to be anyone other than the Red Fox clan. And as Will was fond of telling her, we don't believe in coincidence. Satisfied that there were no further clues to what had been going on, she retraced her steps to the door, pulling it closed behind her as she went out, leaving it as she had found it when she arrived. Bumper raised his head curiously. Find anything? Yes. It seems that Barnaby Codling wasn't imagining things, she told him. We're going to have to come back here and keep an eye on the place. Bumper flicked his tail at an errant horsefly. Suits me. Maddie stroked his neck idly as she considered her options. There was no way of knowing when the foxes might meet here again. That meant she would have to keep a constant watch on the Abbey, and that would mean slipping out of the castle each night via the tunnel. I'm going to have to move you closer to the castle, she said. I'll find a spot for you where the forest begins. She could be spending hours on watch at the Abbey, and the thought of walking each night to get here didn't appeal. And she could hardly ride Sundancer out and switch horses at the farm as she'd done today. She'd be seen leaving and arriving back. If people knew she was absent from the castle for hours each night, questions would be asked, by her mother, among others. And I don't have any answers for her yet, she admitted to herself, just a vague hunch that something underhanded is going on. She rode back to the farm, where Warwick had finished repairing the plow traces and was now replacing a broken hinge on the home paddock gate. Don't you ever have a day off? She asked. He shook his head cheerfully. A farmer doesn't know what that means, he said. Find anything up at the Abbey? She told him about the fox face scratched into the floor. He rubbed his chin thoughtfully as she described it. I never noticed that before, he said. Why would someone do that? She shrugged. I guess to pass the time while they were waiting. Anyway, I'm going to be coming out here for the next few nights to keep watch. I'll find a spot for Bumper closer to the castle. Can you lend me a bucket and a horse blanket for him? She looked at the sky, with white clouds driven by the gusting wind. The rain seemed to have passed. And a sack of oats, if you have them, she added. Warwick nodded and strode into the barn to collect the items she needed. As he handed them to her, he asked, "Want me to come with you to watch the Abbey?" She shook her head. "I'll be better alone. 2 of us will be twice as easy to spot. And I'm used to staying out of sight." She swung up onto Bumper's back and, leaning down, unhitched Sundancer's reins from the post. "I better get back and meet those Scandians," she said. All right, that's going to bring us to the end of Chapter 22. Thank you all for joining me. I'll see you guys next time in Chapter 23. God bless, and have a good one.